The man walked into the courtroom as if he owned it. Tailored navy suit, gold cufflinks, watch gleaming like a miniature sun. Every step was a performance, a silent declaration that money could bend truth. The whispers followed him. That's the tech billionaire, the one who sued his own assistant. She sat quietly at the defendant's table. No lawyer. Just trembling hands gripping a stack of papers and the kind of tired eyes you only get from years of swallowing pride. He smirked when he saw her. She won't last 5 minutes, his expression said. To him, this was routine. He had silenced critics before, buried mistakes under NDAs, and bought apologies with checks. But this time, something was different. At the bench sat an experienced female judge. Silver hair, black robe, eyes that didn't flinch at power. She had seen arrogance dressed in every form: entitlement, ego, and the illusion of control. When the billionaire began to talk, his voice filled the room with self-importance. Every sentence dripped with rehearsed superiority until the judge interrupted. Just once, calmly, precisely, and in that single moment the courtroom shifted, because logic doesn't bow to wealth, and justice doesn't take bribes. By the time she was done with him, the billionaire wasn't smirking anymore. His empire of confidence began to crumble, not from scandal, not from ruin, but from truth spoken with surgical precision. What she said next silenced the entire room, and made millions rethink what power really means. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the kind of scent that carried the weight of unspoken truth. The air was thick with anticipation as the man at the plaintiff's table adjusted his cufflinks for the 4th time in under a minute. Each metallic click echoed off the oak panels like a metronome of arrogance. His name was Alexander Crane, a billionaire tech founder whose empire stretched from social media to private aerospace contracts. He wasn't used to waiting, let alone being questioned. Cameras often sought him, investors bowed to him, and competitors feared him. But today, for the first time in years, he was in a place where none of that mattered. Across the room sat Marissa Lane, his former executive assistant, now the defendant. Her posture was cautious, almost protective, as though the wrong movement might collapse her fragile composure. No lawyer flanked her, no entourage of advisors whispered strategy. Just a worn briefcase, a stack of printouts, and her own trembling determination. The judge, an experienced woman with silver hair and a calm, piercing gaze, surveyed the scene with quiet authority. She had presided over hundreds of cases like this, rich men attempting to weaponize the law against those who dared defy them. She recognized the posture, the smirk, the way power tried to fill a room. "Mr. Crane," she began evenly, "you're here today alleging that Ms. Lane breached a confidentiality agreement, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alexander replied, leaning forward as if to remind everyone how important his time was. "She stole internal company data and attempted to use it for personal gain. My legal team traced several unauthorized document downloads to her login credentials." He said it like he was reading a stock report. Sterile, confident, rehearsed. But beneath that calm exterior was a hunger to make an example of her. Marissa swallowed hard before speaking. "Your Honor, I didn't steal anything. I was instructed to download those files by Mr. Crane himself." He cut her off, smirking. "That's ridiculous. She was an assistant. She took orders for coffee, not corporate strategy." A soft murmur rippled through the spectators' seats. The judge lifted a hand slightly, and silence returned instantly. Her gaze settled on Alexander. "Mr. Crane, you'll let her finish." For the first time, his smile faltered. Marissa's voice wavered but didn't break. "He asked me to delete emails, to clean up the records before an investor audit. Some of those documents were problematic. I didn't understand everything in them, but I knew they were financial reports that didn't match the public statements." Alexander scoffed. "Conspiracy theories. She was fired for incompetence. This is nothing more than retaliation." The judge leaned back, folding her hands. Her tone remained calm, but the precision of her words carried weight. "We'll let the evidence speak. Ms. Lane, do you have documentation of these instructions?" Marissa nodded, sliding a folder across the table. The bailiff carried it forward. Inside were printed screenshots of internal messages, time-stamped, showing Alexander's own username instructing her to purge certain files. The judge's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. The billionaire noticed it too. He straightened, his voice growing sharper. Those could have been fabricated, Your Honor. She had access to editing tools. My IT department. She raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Mr. Crane, do you have your IT department present to testify today? A pause. Not at this time. The courtroom's silence was heavy, like a held breath. The judge continued. Then we'll move forward with what's before us. I'll review the material during recess. She looked directly at him, not intimidated by his tone or his wealth. For now, keep your remarks factual. This isn't a press conference. The faintest flush crept up his neck. As the hearing continued, the layers of Alexander's control began to unravel. He had entered the courtroom believing it was an extension of his boardroom, a place where his charisma could sway outcomes. But each time he tried to perform, the judge's composure dismantled his rhythm. Every deflection met with calm questioning. Every arrogant quip dissolved under silence. Every attempt to dominate was absorbed and neutralized. At one point, he leaned back and whispered to his assistant, "She doesn't understand who she's talking to." But the judge did. She understood perfectly. She'd seen men like him since her early days as a public defender, those who believed that justice could be bent by tone and posture. When the lunch recess was called, Alexander stood, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. Reporters outside would see him confident and untouchable again. But as he walked past the bench, the judge spoke softly, her words stopping him cold. "Mr. Crane," she said, "in my courtroom, wealth has no voice. Only truth does." He turned, briefly stunned. For the first time, there was no witty retort, no charming smirk, just silence. That afternoon, the courtroom filled again. The sunlight had shifted, cutting through the blinds in sharp golden lines that divided the space like a moral diagram, light and shadow in perfect balance. Marissa resumed her place at the table, clutching a small USB drive. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this as evidence," she said. "It's a backup of the deleted files." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That data is proprietary." She had no authorization. The judge cut in smoothly. "Mr. Crane, you claimed she deleted files without your permission. Now you object to her having a backup of what you said she erased. Which is it?" The billionaire froze. The words hung in the air like a verdict. For a brief moment, he tried to smile again, that PR smile honed for magazine covers and investor meetings, but it didn't reach his eyes. Marissa explained, her voice steadier now. "I made the backup because I was afraid he'd blame me for the missing data. I didn't alter anything. I just wanted to protect myself." The judge nodded. "Prudent." Then turning to the clerk, "Mark this as Exhibit C." Alexander exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath meant to mask frustration, but that betrayed it instead. The mask was slipping. The rest of the day became a battle of character, not evidence. He tried to reclaim the narrative, painting himself as a visionary misunderstood by his staff, a perfectionist whose ambition was too large for others to handle. But the judge's questions sliced through the performance like surgical instruments. "Mr. Crane, how many assistants have resigned under your employment in the last year?" 7, Your Honor, but in a competitive industry." "And how many filed formal complaints?" He hesitated. 2. "Were those complaints settled privately?" "Yes, but..." No further answer needed. Every time she cornered him with calm logic, the tension in the room thickened. The audience wasn't just watching a trial. They were witnessing a dismantling, an ego unspooling under the quiet force of truth. By the time the afternoon sun faded, Alexander's tone had lost its sharpness. His voice, once commanding, carried faint traces of defense. He realized, too late, that the judge wasn't impressed by resumes or net worth. She was measuring integrity, not influence. And as the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, Alexander caught his reflection in the polished bench divider. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, and a faint tremor in the hand that once signed billion-dollar deals. For the first time, he looked small. Outside the courtroom, the press waited, microphones raised like a forest of judgment. "Mr. Crane, how do you feel about the allegations? Is it true your assistant exposed internal fraud? Do you plan to settle out of court?" He ignored them, walking briskly to his car. But behind him, Marissa emerged, no entourage. no shield, and when one reporter asked if she was afraid, she simply said, "Not anymore." The cameras turned. The billionaire's jaw set tight as he entered his car, but in the rearview mirror, he saw her standing beneath the courthouse steps, the same woman he'd once dismissed as powerless. The judge's words echoed again in his mind. In my courtroom, wealth has no voice and only truth does. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Crane didn't know what to say. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The air was colder, sharper. Word had spread overnight. The billionaire who'd once silenced rivals was now on the defensive. Reporters filled the back rows. Every camera waited for the next crack in his composure. Alexander Crane arrived early, his expression controlled but his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He had traded his designer suit for something subtler, dark gray understated, a tactical shift in image. But no fabric could soften the edges of a man unraveling from the inside. Marissa Lane, meanwhile, entered quietly, clutching a manila folder. There was no arrogance in her movements, only steadiness, the kind born of someone who's been underestimated too long. She didn't look toward him. She didn't need to. When the judge entered, the room straightened instinctively. Her presence wasn't loud. It was gravitational. Even Alexander, with all his power, felt its pull. "Good morning," she said evenly. "We'll resume proceedings in Crane versus Lane. Mr. Crane, you may continue." He rose, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant continues to misrepresent facts. She has presented private company data out of context, creating a narrative that damages my reputation and undermines the trust of my shareholders." The judge didn't blink. "You've made that point. Proceed with your evidence." He gestured toward the clerk. "I'd like to submit Exhibit D, a series of emails between Ms. Lane and an external journalist. They demonstrate a pattern of intent to leak information." The clerk handed the printouts to the judge. Alexander stood tall, his confidence momentarily revived. "As you can see, she contacted the journalist under a pseudonym. I traced the IP address myself." The judge scanned the pages, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up. "Mr. Crane, are you an IT expert?" He hesitated. "I oversee a technology company, Your Honor." "That's not what I asked." A few chuckles rippled quietly through the gallery before being hushed. Alexander's jaw tightened. She continued, "Did your company's IT department authenticate this data trace?" Another pause. "Not officially, but the evidence speaks for itself." The judge set the pages down gently. "Evidence does not speak, Mr. Crane. People do. And people must do so under oath." The silence that followed cut deeper than any insult. He had expected this to be a performance, or a chance to restore dominance. Instead, it felt like interrogation under a microscope. Marissa stood next. Her voice was firmer now, grounded by truth and the quiet satisfaction of being heard. "Your Honor, those messages were from my personal email. I did reach out to that journalist after I was fired to ask for legal advice. He referred me to a nonprofit that helps whistleblowers. I never sent him any documents." Alexander laughed softly, a condescending sound. "Whistleblower? You're an assistant who misunderstood numbers. You don't even know what you saw." Marissa turned toward him, eyes calm but unwavering. "I know what honesty looks like, and I know what fear feels like when someone tries to bury it." The judge interjected before the moment could turn emotional. "Ms. Lane, can you confirm you did not distribute confidential files?" "Yes, Your Honor. I protected them because I was scared. But I never shared them." "Understood." The judge made a note. Then with that same surgical precision, she shifted focus. "Mr. Crane, would you like to call any witnesses?" He smiled, regaining composure. "Indeed I would. I call Thomas Yates, Chief Operations Officer of Crane Dynamics." A tall man in his 50s approached the stand, polished, cautious, the kind of executive who had survived by never contradicting his boss. He took the oath and sat, avoiding direct eye contact with Marissa. "Mr. Yates," Alexander began, voice smooth again. "You've worked with me for 12 years, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you've had professional interaction with Ms. Lane?" "Briefly, yes." "In your observation, was she ever given clearance to access executive-level financial data?" "No, sir." "Would it be accurate to say she exceeded her authority when retrieving internal reports?" "Yes." Alexander leaned on the podium, voice dripping confidence. And in your professional opinion, could such behavior pose a threat to company security? Absolutely. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Yates, are you aware that Mr. Crane himself instructed Ms. Lane to delete files? Thomas faltered. I wasn't present for that conversation. But if the messages introduced yesterday are authentic, would that instruction constitute a violation of audit compliance law? He looked to Alexander, who gave a subtle nod. I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor. That wasn't the question. Thomas swallowed. It could potentially raise concerns. The judge nodded slightly. Concerns? Yes, I imagine it could. Alexander's smile dimmed. The next hour felt like slow erosion. The more he tried to steer the narrative, the more it collapsed beneath him. The judge wasn't swayed by charm. She dissected contradictions with surgical calm. Every word he used became another thread she pulled loose. When Marissa's turn came to question Thomas, she stood without notes. Her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through pretense. Mr. Yates, do you remember an email chain about an investor report labeled Series D projections? He frowned. Possibly. I handled dozens of reports. Would you agree that Mr. Crane signed off on that report before it was presented publicly? Yes. And were those projections accurate? Alexander's head snapped toward her. Objection. She's not qualified to— Overruled, said the judge, her tone firm. Answer the question, Mr. Yates. Thomas hesitated. There were— Adjustments, she repeated, meaning the public numbers didn't match the internal forecasts. He nodded reluctantly. That's typical in pre-IPO presentations. Marissa nodded, stepping closer. Even when the adjustments make investors believe the company is twice as profitable as it really is. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the gallery. The judge glanced up briefly, not at the audience, but at Alexander. Her silence was a verdict of its own. The questioning ended with Thomas visibly shaken. He avoided Alexander's gaze as he stepped down. The billionaire's jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed near his temple. When the judge called for a brief recess, Alexander stormed into the hallway, trailed by his lawyer and PR consultant. The cameras outside flashed like a firing squad. This is turning into a circus, he muttered. Low enough for his team, but not low enough for the microphones to miss. She's making me look like a criminal. His lawyer whispered something about keeping composure, but Alexander wasn't listening. He paced, muttering about strategy, optics, headlines, everything but truth. Through the courthouse glass, he saw Marissa sitting quietly on a bench, sipping from a paper cup. Alone. Unshaken. That image infuriated him more than any legal setback. He wasn't used to being powerless, and it showed. Back in session, the tone was different. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on him. Mr. Crane, I've reviewed the message logs and financial exhibits. There appear to be inconsistencies in your testimony regarding who authorized data deletions. He forced a smile. With respect, Your Honor, running a billion-dollar corporation involves hundreds of moving parts. I can't personally oversee every file. Yet you testified yesterday that you specifically instructed Ms. Lane not to access those files. Yes, that's correct. And today, you've said you didn't personally oversee them. He blinked, realizing the trap. I meant, my directives were general. Her tone didn't rise, but the precision of her words pinned him in place. General or specific, Mr. Crane? You can't have both. The gallery fell utterly silent. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's pen scratched across paper. Alexander felt the temperature drop. He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. Would you like a moment to clarify? The judge asked softly. He swallowed hard. No, Your Honor. Good, she said, and the faintest trace of something, not satisfaction but recognition, flickered across her face. Let's proceed. As the day wore on, Alexander's mask continued to crack. He stumbled through his next responses, relying on rehearsed phrases that no longer held power. Each time he dodged a question, the judge countered with another, relentless, calm, unflinching. Marissa, by contrast, grew steadier. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was relief. The quiet kind that comes when truth finally gets a microphone. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she said simply, "Because I thought no one would believe me." He had everyone convinced that loyalty meant silence. The judge nodded. And now? Now I understand loyalty should mean honesty. The judge glanced at Alexander. A valuable distinction. That single remark hit harder than any ruling. The billionaire shifted in his chair, the first visible sign of defeat in his posture. By late afternoon, the courtroom lights dimmed to a softer hue. Papers rustled, pens clicked, but the energy had shifted entirely. The spectators weren't watching a titan win. They were witnessing his myth dissolve. The judge reviewed one last piece of evidence, a printed company memo detailing the deletion of financial records. The signature at the bottom read A. Crane. Mr. Crane, she said quietly. Is this your signature? He looked at it, then up at her. It's my digital authorization, yes. So you acknowledge approving this deletion? I do, but only because it was an administrative cleanup. Nothing illegal, she leaned back. And yet those same files contained discrepancies later flagged by auditors, correct? He froze. Did you inform your board about those discrepancies? No. Did you inform investors? No. Then perhaps it's not Ms. Lane who endangered your company's reputation. The gavel hadn't struck, but everyone felt the impact. As the courtroom adjourned for the second day, the billionaire remained seated for a long moment, staring blankly at the polished surface of his table. His reflection stared back, tired, cornered, human. He had built an empire on control, but control was slipping through his fingers like sand. The judge hadn't raised her voice once, yet she had dismantled years of practiced dominance with patience and logic. When he finally stood, the gallery parted instinctively, not out of respect but discomfort. He left the room without looking back. Marissa gathered her papers quietly. For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale. Not victory, not yet, but relief. The judge watched her for a moment longer than usual before exiting. There was something in her eyes, the recognition of another woman who had learned. Over decades, that power only means something when it's used to protect, not punish. And somewhere deep in Alexander's mind, beneath the pride and the fury, a sliver of realization began to take root. He wasn't fighting a lawsuit anymore. He was fighting the truth. And the truth was winning. The third morning dawned gray and windless, the kind of sky that seemed to hold its breath before a storm. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. Journalists clustered around the entrance, their lenses trained on the doors like sentries waiting for movement. They weren't there for a simple case anymore. They were there to watch the mighty fall. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The quiet before the session wasn't calm, it was charged. The clerk shuffled papers, the bailiff adjusted his tie, and every spectator knew something irreversible was coming. Alexander Crane entered with that same deliberate confidence, but the edges were frayed. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the controlled gestures, they still played the part, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He hadn't slept. The facade of control was cracking under the slow weight of exposure. Marissa Lane sat across the aisle, composed. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She was too tired for that. But there was a steadiness to her, a quiet resilience that no amount of money could manufacture. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about release. The experienced female judge, silver hair tied neatly behind her head, entered the courtroom without fanfare. The sound of the bailiff's command, "All rise, Guignon," cut through the murmurs like a blade. Everyone stood. When she took her seat, the silence that followed wasn't just respect, it was anticipation. "Court is now in session," she said. "This will be the final hearing before I issue my judgment." Alexander's lawyer rose first, hoping to reclaim ground. His tone was smooth, rehearsed, dripping with authority. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Crane, is a man of integrity. While there may have been administrative missteps, there was no malicious intent. The defendant's accusations are speculative and unsupported by qualified witnesses." The judge didn't interrupt, but her pen moved steadily, a rhythm of calm notation. The lawyer continued. "We urge the court to consider the defendant's motives. She was dismissed for performance issues and now seeks to discredit the very company that gave her opportunity." When he finished, the judge looked up, her eyes cold but calm. "Thank you. I'll keep your remarks in mind." Then she turned to Marissa. "Ms. Lane, you may proceed." Marissa stood, her hand steady for the first time in days. "Your Honor, I never wanted this. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came because I was told to lie, and I couldn't." Her voice trembled, not from fear but from release. Mr. Crane asked me to delete files that hid losses. When I hesitated, he told me I'd never work in this city again. I was scared, I did it. But I kept copies because I knew it was wrong. She held up a printed report. Exhibit F. This is one of those files. It shows millions reported as profit that were actually debt, reclassified under temporary funding lines. A murmur swept through the room. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching. Marissa continued. I was the one who sent those numbers to investors. I was the one who watched them celebrate fake success. And when I couldn't live with it anymore, I became the scapegoat. She looked directly at Alexander. You told me integrity was weakness. That truth doesn't matter when you're winning. But the truth has a way of catching up. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on Marissa. Ms. Lane, did you personally witness any directives to falsify or destroy financial information? Yes, Your Honor, several times. He would send verbal instructions and I'd get follow-up messages confirming them. Do you still have those messages? Yes, she said, passing another folder to the bailiff. The judge flipped through it silently. For a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the turning of pages. Then she spoke, voice level but cutting. Mr. Crane, these messages show direct authorization from your personal account, dated 3 weeks before the audit. Do you dispute their authenticity? Alexander rose slowly. Your Honor, those messages are taken out of context. Every executive delegate's administrative tasks. These were simple maintenance instructions. The judge looked up. Deleting entire audit trails isn't maintenance. He tried to respond but hesitated, words stalling in his throat. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The judge adjusted her glasses and spoke clearly. Mr. Crane, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Did you knowingly order the concealment of financial information from auditors? He met her eyes, and for the first time his expression wasn't arrogance. It was calculation mixed with desperation. No, Your Honor, I gave no such order. She nodded slowly. Under oath, then? Yes, he said firmly. Marissa's attorney, a volunteer from the nonprofit, he understood. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence. A video clip appeared on the courtroom monitor. Security footage from Crane Dynamics' private conference room. The date stamp matched the same week as the disputed emails. The footage showed Alexander pacing, voice raised. I don't care how you do it, just make the numbers look clean before they see them. I'm not losing another investor to bad optics. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, then turned toward him. Mr. Crane, that's your voice? He swallowed hard. Yes, then your previous answer is false. He said nothing. The silence was damning. It was over. Everyone knew it. The billionaire sank slowly into his seat. His lawyer whispered something frantic, but he didn't respond. His hands, once steady and commanding, now trembled on the tabletop. The judge took off her glasses and folded them neatly beside her notes. The weight of years in her profession, of seeing pride, deceit, and redemption, pressed behind her gaze. Mr. Crane, she began quietly, the law does not exist to protect comfort. It exists to reveal truth, and truth, once uncovered, does not care for status. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. You brought this case believing money could frame the narrative. But you've learned that logic is a force far greater than wealth, because it cannot be bought. He looked up at her, hollow-eyed. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The media, the investors. I understand perfectly, she said. I just don't sympathize. The gallery erupted in murmurs. The bailiff called for silence. She continued, her voice calm, deliberate, and surgical. You attempted to weaponize this court to punish an employee who refused to lie for you. You accused her of theft to protect your image, and in doing so you exposed your own misconduct. The sound of the gavel was sharp, final. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court will forward the evidence of corporate fraud to the district attorney's office for review. Alexander's face drained of color. You can't, I can, she said simply. And I just did. Marissa covered her mouth, tears forming, a nod of triumph but relief. Her trembling shoulders told the story of years spent beneath someone's shadow, finally stepping into light. The judge looked at her kindly. Ms. Lane, you've endured what few could. The truth costs more than people think, but it always pays in peace. You are free to go. Marissa nodded, whispering, Thank you, Your Honor. Alexander remained frozen, disbelief carving lines into his face. For the first time, there was no PR spin, no strategy left, only silence, thick, humiliating, and absolute. He muttered under his breath, "You think this is justice?" "I built thousands of jobs," the judge stood, cutting him off. "Then you should have built them on honesty. This isn't about what you created, Mr. Crane. It's about what you corrupted." She turned to leave, but then paused, her final words landing like a closing argument written by fate itself. The higher a man builds on ego, the farther he falls when truth finally speaks. The gavel struck one last time. As the courtroom emptied, the billionaire sat alone, staring at the empty judge's bench. The echo of her words played over and over in his head. The cameras outside would be waiting, but for the first time he didn't care. There was no version of this story that could be rewritten. Marissa walked past him on her way out. She didn't look at him, didn't speak, but her silence was louder than any victory speech. It was the sound of dignity reclaimed. Outside, the sky had begun to break open. Light filtered through the clouds in pale, forgiving rays. Reporters swarmed her with questions, but she just said softly, "The truth won. That's all that matters." Behind her, the courthouse doors closed on Alexander Crane, a man who had spent his life buying influence, only to discover that justice was never for sale. Hours later, in the solitude of his penthouse, Alexander stood before a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, the city he once controlled now indifferent. His phone buzzed with messages, investors withdrawing, board members resigning, reporters requesting statements. He ignored them all. For the first time in years, there was no one left to command. No one to admire him. Only silence and the faint hum of a city moving on without him. On the table nearby, the court transcript lay open. His name appeared again and again, not as a visionary, but as a warning. He stared at it until the letters blurred. The judge's voice echoed in his mind. The higher a man builds on ego, the farther he falls when truth finally speaks. He closed his eyes, and somewhere, deep in that quiet space between humiliation and humanity, something inside him began to crack, not out of anger this time, but recognition. Because when logic dismantles arrogance, it doesn't just punish, it reveals. And Alexander Crane, for the first time, finally saw himself clearly. The verdict echoed beyond the courtroom walls. It rippled through newsrooms, boardrooms, and every corner of social media, where power once felt untouchable. Within hours, the name Alexander Crane, once synonymous with innovation and wealth, became shorthand for arrogance exposed. But inside the courthouse, long after the crowd had dispersed, the true story wasn't about a billionaire's fall. It was about what came after, the quiet reckoning that follows when the noise fades and truth remains. That evening, the experienced female judge sat in her chambers, the warm glow of a single lamp softening the sharp lines of the day. Her silver hair framed a face that carried both weariness and certainty. She had seen it all before. Empires collapsing under their own deceit. Men confusing ambition with entitlement. Still, this case lingered with her. Not because of its scandal, but because of its humanity. She looked down at her notes, careful handwriting on crisp yellow paper. At the top, underlined twice, was a single phrase she'd written during recess. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth reclaiming its place. She closed the folder gently. Some cases end with applause. Others end with silence. This one ended with something purer. Clarity. Outside in the cool night air, Marissa Lane stood on the courthouse steps, the same place she had once stood trembling at the start of the trial. This time her shoulders were squared, her hands steady. The cameras had gone. The reporters had moved on to the next scandal. The world's attention was fickle, but her peace was permanent. A man from the nonprofit that had represented her stepped up beside her. "You did good, Marissa. Not many would have had the courage." She smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for revenge. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere other than my own head." He nodded. "That's how real change starts. Quietly." For the first time in months, she took a deep breath without fear. She didn't know what her future held. New job, new city, maybe even a new beginning. But she knew one thing for certain. She'd never let fear disguise itself as loyalty again. Meanwhile, high above the city, Alexander Crane sat alone in his penthouse office, surrounded by symbols of the empire he had built, awards, photos, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. But none of it felt solid anymore. The phone on his desk buzzed relentlessly. Board demands emergency meeting. Shareholders seeking leadership vote. SEC requesting immediate cooperation. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he poured himself a drink and stared at the reflection of the city lights trembling in the glass, distorted, flickering like the illusion of control he'd mistaken for strength. On the TV, a news anchor spoke his name. He turned up the volume. Today, in a landmark ruling, a billionaire tech mogul was exposed for falsifying company records and retaliating against an employee who refused to comply. The judge's decision has been hailed as a victory for accountability and a reminder that justice remains blind to wealth. He turned the screen off, the echo of his own downfall bouncing around the empty room. Hours later, he wandered to the balcony, the city's hum distant below. The wind was sharp, the night heavy with consequence. For years, he had lived above the world, higher floors, higher ceilings, higher stakes. But tonight that height felt like isolation. He remembered something the judge had said, and the truth doesn't care for status. The words had sounded like scolding then, but now they rang with something else. Finality. He'd spent his life commanding loyalty through fear and money. Yet in the end, it was honesty, from a woman he'd once dismissed, that brought him down. And strangely, beneath the anger and humiliation, a small part of him admired her for it. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the wind, "I taught her to survive me." And she did. The next morning, headlines hit like thunder. Crane Dynamics faces federal probe. Investors withdraw support after courtroom scandal. Assistant's courage sparks whistleblower protection debate. For the first time, the billionaire's empire wasn't his to control. His PR firm resigned. His CFO released a statement distancing herself from individual wrongdoing. Employees leaked stories, late-night rants, impossible demands, toxic meetings. The mask was off, and yet the judge's decision had done something deeper than destroy a company. It had restored faith in fairness. Clips of the trial went viral. Millions watched that single moment when calm logic outshone moneyed arrogance. The moment the judge leaned forward and said, "Logic does not bow to wealth." Students quoted it. Journalists praised it. Even cynics found themselves, for a fleeting second, believing again in the possibility that truth could win. Weeks later, Marissa sat in a small cafe overlooking a quiet park. The trial was over, but the world was still adjusting. She'd received job offers, some sincere, others exploitative. But she hadn't decided what came next. She didn't crave the spotlight. What she wanted was normalcy, the kind of life where mornings began with coffee, not subpoenas. She opened her laptop to an email from the nonprofit's director, Marissa. "We're expanding our advocacy team for workplace transparency. Would you consider joining us? You'd be a valuable voice for people who think no one will believe them." She read it twice, a slow smile forming. Maybe her ordeal hadn't been the end of something. Maybe it was the start of something else entirely. Across town, Alexander faced his own reckoning. The boardroom that had once echoed with applause now buzzed with tension. His executives sat in silence as a new interim CEO took his seat at the head of the table. Alexander stood to the side, stripped of authority but invited, symbolically, to witness the transition. It was a formality, but it felt like exile. The new CEO spoke with the calm confidence of someone who knew the room's eyes were waiting for a cue. "Today," he said, "we rebuild on integrity. No more shortcuts, no more arrogance disguised as genius." There was polite applause. None of it reached Alexander. He walked out before the meeting ended. For the first time, no one followed him. Days turned to weeks, and the headlines began to fade. The world moved on, as it always does. But the people who had witnessed that trial, those who had seen wealth stripped bare by truth, carried it with them. The judge continued her work, presiding over new cases with the same calm clarity. But every so often, when she glanced at her gavel, she remembered the day she watched arrogance turn to silence. Marissa began speaking publicly about ethics in corporate workplaces. She didn't dramatize her story. She simply told the truth. Audiences leaned in not because of the scandal, but because of her quiet conviction. Alexander disappeared from the public eye. Rumors surfaced of him selling off properties, of private therapy retreats, of exile abroad. But the truth was simpler. He was learning to live without applause. One evening, nearly a year later, Marissa received a small letter in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Ms. Lane, there's no excuse for what I did. I believed control was the same as strength. I was wrong. You didn't just win a case. You taught me the difference between fear and respect. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. AC, she read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. She didn't need to reply. Some apologies didn't need an audience. Outside her window, the evening light shifted across the park, golden and soft, like the kind of peace that only follows chaos. In her closing remarks on the day of the verdict, the judge had said something that didn't make it into the transcripts, spoken quietly as the courtroom emptied. The law can't change hearts, but sometimes it can open eyes, and maybe in some small way that's what this story had done. Opened eyes. The billionaire learned that power without humility is a prison. The assistant learned that truth, though costly, is freedom. And the judge, she remained what she'd always been. The quiet keeper of balance, reminding the world that justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't shout. It simply stands unwavering in the light.